ayons le plaisir d'accueillir parmi nous Étienne Balibar qui fait l'amitié de passer alors qu'il a un emploi du temps surchargé. Nous en sommes très heureux parce que sa présence s'imposait dans la mesure où vraiment c'est lui qui fait aussi la jonction entre France et États-Unis d'une certaine manière. Il en dira quelques mots.
Non, n'ajoute pas, Chantal.
Je n'en dirai pas plus,
Merci.
Étienne parlera de lui-même. Et d'autre part, je voulais préciser que pour les interventions, il faudrait bien respecter le timing, puisque nous devons rendre la salle à 18h. Et je voudrais en particulier
Oui, j'avais fait une conférence ce matin et j'étais, oui c'est ça, oui, j'étais pris tout le temps.
Puisque c'est une salle qu'on ne donne que dans de grandes occasions exceptionnelles.
Ah bah,
et c'est
gentil.
effectivement le cas, c'est exceptionnel, en espérant que l'exception se multipliera dans le futur. Merci à tous.
Merci Chantal. Bon, je ne sais pas si je suis censé présider en français ou en anglais ou dans les deux. Il y avait une loi, autrefois en France, la loi Toubon, qui interdisait, elle est peut-être toujours en vigueur, interdisant l'usage de l'anglais dans les locaux universitaires français. Mais en l'anglais, enfin non, pas l'usage de l'anglais, l'usage des langues étrangères. Enfin, tout le monde comprenait que c'était l'anglais. Bon. Et donc, seulement je crois que les violets, etc. Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here with you. I thank Chantal for her more than generous introduction. I must say I'm extremely frustrated that I couldn't attend any of the previous sessions, and I think it's a great honor to have been asked to chair this one. Okay, so we shouldn't waste time to begin. Our first speaker this afternoon is Stephen Nadler. Hardly necessary to introduce him. We all read his Life of Spinoza, his book on Spinoza's heresy. Some of us are using his introduction to the Ethics. His topic today is Spinoza on the objectivity of good and evil. Is that it?
That's it, oui.
Yes, and so you're supposed to speak 30 minutes.
Oui.
Oui. Et après, nous aurons le commentaire de Lorenzo Vinciguerra pendant 10 minutes environ, ce qui devrait nous laisser à peu près un quart d'heure, compte tenu de l'heure qu'il est maintenant, parce que c'est très strict, un quart d'heure de discussion générale. Stephen.
Merci bien. C'est difficile à présenter juste après le déjeuner, mais j'essayais. Je voudrais aussi remercier Chantal, Jacques, Charles, Pascal et Pierre-François pour ce très beau colloque. Merci beaucoup. Maintenant je traduis le mot mal par bad et pas evil, parce que le mot evil a des connotations théologiques et je voudrais éviter ces connotations. If there's one thing about Spinoza's moral philosophy that is crystal clear, it is this: nothing is good or bad in itself, not nature as a whole, and not anything in nature. There are no values embedded in the world. Nothing exists for the sake of some higher purpose or end, and nothing considered on its own is better or worse than anything else. Whatever is, just is. Period. In Spinoza's metaphysics, all things necessarily exist and act by the laws of nature, and there are no individuals or objects or states of affairs in nature that are, intrinsically and without relationship to anything else, good. But if being good is not an intrinsic feature of things, then what is its status? What is it for something to be good or bad? And this is a point on which there is some significant disagreement among scholars. In this lecture, I take issue with a prevalent subjectivist tendency in reading Spinoza's account of good. According to the different versions of this interpretation, something's being good is nothing but a matter of opinion, a human construction, an expression of desire, a form of prejudice, and even a confusion in the minds of the untutored. I argue that, on the contrary, the qualities good and bad for Spinoza are, if not real and intrinsic affections of things in the world, Nonetheless, they remain objective and, in a sense, mind-independent, albeit relational features of them. What makes something good in the most basic sense, as I will show, is that it is the cause of a positive affect in an individual. The paper you have says a positive passive affect. I shouldn't have said that. Just positive affect, pas passif. Pas justement passif. That is, something is good if it causes an increase in that individual's conatus, or power of acting. And correlatively, something is bad if it is the cause of a negative affect in an individual, of a decrease in that individual's power. And what makes something good in the truest and fullest sense of the term is that it so improves the power of an individual as to bring that individual closer to the ideal condition of its nature. In the case of human beings, it helps one become more like the more perfect human being, that is, in Spinoza's words, the exemplar of human nature. Spinoza could not be more forthright and unambiguous about his view that good and bad are not real and intrinsic features of things, qualities that characterize things taken by themselves and independent of any relation to anything else. It is, in fact, something that formed an important part of his thinking from the very start of his philosophical career. In the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, Spinoza notes, right at the beginning of the work, as he reflects on the various pursuits of his youth and his career, his unsuccessful career as a merchant. And this is quote number 1 on the handout. All the things which were the cause of object of fear or object of my fear had nothing of good or bad in themselves, except insofar as my mind was moved by them. Nothing considered in its own nature, in sua natura spectatum, he says, is good or bad. This view finds a more perspicuous geometrical presentation in the Ethics. In the preface to Part 4 of the Ethics, which contains Spinoza's most important and detailed presentation of his views on good and bad, he says that, and this is quote number 2, as far as good and bad are concerned, they also indicate nothing positive in things considered in themselves, nor are they anything other than modes of thinking or notions that we form because we compare things to one another. Spinoza is apparently moved to emphasize this point about the ontological status of good and bad because of a habitual mistake made by most non-philosophical people. The ignorant, he says in the appendix, typically attribute normative qualities to things in their own right. Much as the common folk project sensory qualities in the mind, like color or warmth, onto objects themselves, so they are convinced that these other modes of thinking really characterize things as well. The passages above, with their claims that good and bad are only modes of thinking, modes of imagining, notions and beings of reason, these passages seem to suggest that Spinoza believes that something is good or bad only because someone regards it as good or bad, and that there is nothing more to its goodness or badness than this personal assessment. In other words, that its goodness is solely in the eye of the beholder. While other beholders may or may not happen to agree with that assessment, there is no way to demonstrate or justify the truth of the assessment in a publicly accessible way. This is because on this reading there really is no truth of the matter beyond a personal one, no more than it is true that vanilla is the best flavor of ice cream. The comparison Spinoza draws in the preface of Part 4 between the notions of good and bad and other evaluative concepts, such as perfect and imperfect, reinforces the impression that this is his view. Nothing, he claims, is in itself perfect or imperfect. Products of human artisanship are regarded as more or less perfect only according to how well they match up either with the artisan maker's original intention or with some individual's conception of what an ideal specimen of that kind should be. And because one person's ideal of a certain kind of thing may be different from another person's ideal of that kind of thing, the former's judgment about what is not perfect will differ from the latter's. If two people have different universal ideas about what a house or a table or ice cream should be, They will arrive at different evaluative judgments about how perfect this or that house or table or ice cream is. These judgments are nothing more than their respective opinions based on highly subjective, even variable, even arbitrary criteria. Similarly, natural things are judged to be more or less perfect only because of the common but false belief that nature, like art, is teleological, that it acts in purposive ways to achieve certain ends. A withered tree is in fact an imperfect tree only in the mind of the perceiver, who has a certain conception of what a tree is or how nature should function. The conclusion that Spinoza draws is that, quote, men are accustomed to call natural things perfect or imperfect more from prejudice than from true knowledge of those things. For Spinoza, then, perfect and imperfect are wholly subjective notions and do nothing more than express individual and idiosyncratic opinion. They have their source in and are valid for only the person making the judgment. Something is perfect or imperfect only if someone believes it to be so. Its perfection and imperfection consists only in that person's believing it to be so. It is perfect for only that person and in his eyes, and he will believe it to be so only because he has come up with some general but highly personal conception of what that thing should be. The passages about perfection and goodness from the Ethics might suggest that for Spinoza, good and bad are no less subjective than perfection and imperfection, and for the same reasons. His statement that good and bad, quote, also indicate nothing positive in things, comes immediately after his deflationary discussion of perfection. In the all-important appendix to Part 1 of the Ethics, where Spinoza explains the ramifications for religion of his metaphysics of God or nature, he notes that, and this is quote number 4, after men persuaded themselves that everything that happens on their account, they had to judge that what is most important in each thing is what is most useful to them, and to rate as most excellent all those things by which they were most pleased. Hence they had to form these notions by which they explain natural things: good, bad, order, confusion, warm, cold, beauty, ugliness. The comparison in this passage of good and bad with sensory qualities like warmth and coldness, and with aesthetic judgments like beauty and ugliness, might seem telling. Evaluations of good and bad, it would appear, are no less personal and idiosyncratic than the undeniably personal and idiosyncratic judgments about how something sensibly feels or aesthetically looks. No one who is well enough informed scientifically would argue that the qualitative felt warmth of water or the perceived ugliness of some creature's visage is really in the thing itself. Similarly, it would seem, no one should believe that goodness is really out there in the world, or so Spinoza might appear to be saying. The idea then would be that something is good if and only if a person believes it to be good. Or, since one may experience approval of a thing without necessarily having any firm beliefs about it, perhaps one simply has a good feeling or some other affective attitude toward the thing without really believing anything about it, it might be better to substitute for believes the phrase pro-attitude. This can refer to any number of ways of experiencing approval of something. It may be through a belief about the thing, but it might alternatively involve being drawn to it in a non-cognitive manner, such as through affectionate desire. And a person may find that she simply likes or approves of something without having any particular beliefs about it. Thus, the claim under discussion, and that I will be objecting to, is better put by saying that for Spinoza, something would be good if and only if a person has a pro-attitude towards it. On this account, a person's pro-attitude or approval or endorsement of the thing would be all there is to its goodness, whatever may be the cause of this approval or pro-attitude. In light of his claims about the non-intrinsic nature of goodness of things, and his desire to dispel the notion that the world is imbued with values, Spinoza appears on the face of it to go to the opposite extreme and to treat good and bad, like perfection and imperfection, as thoroughly subjective, as imaginary, misleading, and even pernicious fictions that, when projected onto nature as if they are objective features of it, can deceive us into superstitious religious belief. Now, there is for Spinoza a very close relationship between what effect a thing has on a person and what is good. There is also an intimate connection between what a person desires and what is good. And yet, I think it would be a mistake to think that Spinoza is prepared to regard good and bad as solely mind-dependent, to think that he is willing to dismiss them as subjective imaginings, as confusions or prejudices common among the untutored. These evaluative notions may not refer to ontically real and intrinsic, that is, non-relational features that characterize things absolutely and in themselves. However, I'll argue that for Spinoza, the goodness or badness of some thing or action is a non-mind-dependent, objective matter of fact about that thing. When, unlike the ignorant masses, we judge rightly about such things, our evaluations will capture certain truths about the world and not just truths about what we think. So to sort things out, let's begin with a survey of the several different kinds of statements that Spinoza makes about good and bad in the ethics. And here they are in their order of appearance, starting with part 3. So quote number 5 has the 9 statements. Number 1, it's clear that we neither strive for nor will, neither want nor desire anything because we judge it to be good. On the contrary, we judge something to be good because we strive for it, will it, want it, and desire it. And he repeats this idea 30 propositions later, adding some more detail. This is number 2. By good here I understand every kind of joy and whatever leads to it, and especially which satisfies any kind of longing, whatever it may be. And by bad I understand every kind of sadness, and especially what frustrates longing. For we have shown above that we desire nothing because we judge it to be good, but on the contrary we call it good because we desire it. Consequently, what we are averse to we call bad, and so each one from his own affect judges or evaluates what is good and what is bad, what is better and what is worse, and finally what is best and what is worse. We seem in these passages still to be in the realm of a kind of subjectivism. Goodness is a function of someone having a pro-attitude or approval toward, or in some way expressing an endorsement of a thing. Something is good because someone desires it, and it is good only for that person and only as long as she desires it. Or, as the point is made in passage 2, something is good if it causes joy in a person or satisfies some desire she has. Apparently, it does not matter what kind of desire is at stake or what is the desire for. If something causes joy or pleasure in a person, they will desire it and judge it to be good. And the goodness of the thing consists in nothing more than its being so desired and so judged. Or so it might seem from this passage. Nonetheless, Spinoza's considered position in the ethics is not a reduction of good and bad to a matter of personal approbation. To see that this is so, let us turn to some additional passages, and especially the discussion of good and bad in part 4. And from these texts, we should be able to see that it is absolutely not the case that something is good simply and solely because someone believes it to be good, or desires it, or has some kind of positive attitude toward it. Although it is the case that if something is good, then there will be in the person for whom it is good a pro-attitude towards it. So here are the relevant passages. Number 3. By good I shall understand what we certainly know to be useful to us. By bad, however, I shall understand what we certainly know prevents us from being masters of some good. Number 4. We call good or bad what is useful to or harmful to preserve our being, what increases or diminishes, aids or restrains our power of acting. Therefore, insofar as we perceive that a thing affects us with joy or sadness, we call it good or bad. And so knowledge of good and bad is nothing but an idea of joy or sadness which follows necessarily from the affect of joy or sadness. Number 5. Insofar as a thing agrees with our nature, it is necessarily good. Number 6. Nothing, therefore, can be good except insofar as it agrees with our nature. So the more a thing agrees with our nature, the more useful it is, and conversely, QED. Number 7, those things are good which bring about the preservation of the proportion of motion and rest the body's parts have one to one another. On the other hand, those things are bad which bring it about that the parts of the human body have a different proportion of motion and rest to one another. Number 8, since those things are good and which assist the parts of the body to perform their function, and joy consists in the fact that man's power, insofar as he consists of mind and body, is aided or increased. All things that bring joy are good. Number 9, I shall understand by good what we know certainly is a means by which we may approach nearer and nearer to the model of human nature that we set before ourselves, and by bad what we certainly know prevents us from becoming like that model. Need I say more? The first thing to note about these passages is that they are not all about the same thing. Some of them concern our beliefs or judgments about what is good and bad. Others are statements about the goodness or badness of things or actions. They are claims about what makes something good or bad. And at least one of the passages, number 4, seems to be primarily about linguistic usage. These are distinct issues and should not be confused. The statements about the judgments we make concerning good and bad, like the claims from part 3 in passages 1 and 2, do not by themselves say or imply that what makes something good or bad is that we desire it. At the same time, it may turn out that we do always desire and hence judge to be good what is in fact and in some way more or less good. That is, desire and consequently judgment may track goodness, at least as it is possessed to some degree or another by things. Or the situation may be more restricted than this, in that it is only when desire is properly informed by knowledge that what we, consequent to desire, judge to be good, really is good. And this is what needs to be investigated. And I'm confident that in the end, all of this fits together into a single coherent account. So, what exactly does make something good or bad? In passages 3 through 9, as well as numerous other texts, Spinoza offers what initially seems to be different responses to this question. He claims that what is good is what is useful to an individual, what preserves our being, what increases or aids our power of acting, what agrees with our nature, what brings joy, what is a means by which we may approach nearer and nearer to the model of human nature that we set before ourselves, and what assists the parts of the body to perform their function or preserves the proportion of motion and rest between its parts. In fact, as we shall see, these all amount to basically the same thing. And understanding this, however, demands that we bear in mind Spinoza's account of human nature, and especially his explanation of the affects that constitute the dominant feature of our mental lives and the desire that accompanies them. So just a quick review of Spinoza's moral psychology. The emotions or affects are the active and passive ways in which the mind and the body of an individual undergo changes in their power of acting or force of existing, that is, in their conatus or striving. Conatus is the motivational force that lies at the root of all of a person's endeavors. In the human mind, it is the conscious aversion to things that might weaken it and the conscious striving after those things that, as far as it can tell, promote its well-being and preserve and increase its power. An affect just is any change in an individual's power of acting or conatus, whether for better or for worse. It is either the move from a better condition to a worse condition or the improvement to a better condition. The increases or decreases in an individual's power can come about either through the action of external things, these are the passive affects, or from within. And finally, Spinoza believes that there are, in fact, three primary passive affects: joy, sadness, and desire. Desire is the conatus or power itself as it appears in the conscious mind. Joy is the passion by which the mind passes to a greater perfection. And sadness is the passion by which the mind passes to a lesser perfection. All right, now let's try to make a coherent account of all this in terms of good and bad. We know that every individual, by its nature, strives to persevere. And what this involves is an effort to maintain and even increase its conatus, or power of acting. It is, in essence, a striving to increase its power of striving. In fact, every individual is nothing but such a conatus, or striving to persevere. And what passages 3 through 8 show us is that something is good, truly good, if and only if it aids the individual in its striving or helps it increase its power of acting or contributes to the preservation of its being, all of these being one and the same thing. And because something that helps an individual in its striving to persevere is useful to that individual, and in that respect, what is good can also be described as what is useful to an individual. Moreover, because conatus just is an individual's essence or nature, what is useful to that individual, and hence what is good, is what agrees with that individual's nature. Finally, since the passion of joy is defined as an extreme, externally caused increase in an individual's power of acting, something that causes joy in an individual is also, by that fact, good. As Spinoza succinctly puts it in Part 3, by good here I understand every kind of joy and whatever leads to it. So this is Spinoza's account of what makes something good. Something is good if it is a cause of joy. That is, if it contributes to an individual's striving to persevere, to its efforts to maintain and even increase its power. And correlatively, something is bad if it is a cause of pain or sadness. That is, if it hinders this striving or weakens an individual's power. Of course, some things contribute in a temporary and small-scale way to an individual's power. And these would be sources of minor or partial joy, and thus good in a very limited sense. Eating a rich and fattening meal just before giving a presentation in a colloquium with many desserts might be momentarily pleasant, and thus be a cause of some positive, passive affect. At the same time, these short-term sources of partial joy typically have deleterious long-term consequences, and so they do not constitute true and lasting goods. In the end, they bring a decrease in power. Real goods are those that bring a more permanent increase in power of greater scope, a more lasting joy to a greater part of us and even to our whole being. Now, this account is clearly consistent with Spinoza's repeated claim that nothing is good in itself, on its own, or considered in its own nature, since nothing is good except insofar as it is a cause of joy in some individual, insofar as it is useful to that individual and aids it in its striving. What this means, then, is that something's being good is certainly not a subjective affair. The goodness of something is not reducible to someone having a pro-attitude toward it. Although if something is good, that person will have a pro-attitude or desire toward it. In other words, relativism is not subjectivism. If something aids or restrains an individual's power of acting, it's conatus. If it is a cause of a positive affect, this is an objective, non-mind-dependent matter of fact. It is a relational, not an absolute or intrinsic matter of fact about the thing, but an objective matter of fact nonetheless. Similarly, being soluble in water is an objective, non-mind-dependent feature of salt. It is independent of anyone's beliefs about or attitude towards salt and its relationship to water. It is not, however, an intrinsic and absolute, that is, non-relational feature of salt, since it is dependent as well on the chemical constitution of water and the interaction between the two. It may be the case that someone's believing or wanting a thing to be useful to them might contribute to its actually being useful, and this would be something interesting for psychology to investigate. But whether or not the thing does indeed turn out to be useful is not reducible to the person's believing or wanting it to be useful. We still have one final puzzle, though. Passage 9 from the Ethics, which seems to be the odd man out among our passages. Passage 9 could be seen as providing hope and we know hope is not a good affect, but providing hope for one who wants to find a kind of subjectivism lurking in Spinoza's account of what is good. And this is because 9 links goodness to the immediately preceding discussion of perfection, and perfection really does seem to be a subjective affair. Something is perfect or imperfect only with respect to some ideal, some wholly subjective model that a person may have in mind. Not only do such models vary from one person to the next, depending upon their beliefs or experience, but if no one actually conceives the model and undertakes the mental activity of making the comparison, then there is no perfection. Therefore, Spinoza concludes, perfection and imperfection are only modes of thinking. And following up on this, passage 9 says that good and bad also involve a comparative measure with respect to some model. And the model of human nature would seem, on the face of it, to be no different from the other kinds of models with reference to which things are judged to be more or less perfect. The model table, the model tree, the model giraffe, the model ice cream, the lactis calidus exemplar. You're welcome. You're wondering what the Latin would be for the model ice cream. Lactis calidus exemplar. In this case, judgments about good and bad would appear to be no less subjective than judgments about perfection. It could still be an objective matter of fact whether or not something does or does not help one achieve or come closer to the ideal conditions specified in the model. But the subjectivity and arbitrariness of the ideal itself would presumably infect the whole affair, the whole edifice. A thing either does or does not help a person become more like the model that he may have in mind as the ideal human being. And this is not subjective. What one may believe or feel about it has no bearing. But if the relevant model human being, no less than the model tree or the ideal ice cream, if that's subjective, if it were an idiosyncratic matter specific to that person and her experience, values, and desires, then so too would be the goodness or badness of the thing under consideration, since whether or not the thing is good depends ultimately on the highly personal, even arbitrary choice of model. However, Spinoza's metaphysics does allow him to say that there is in fact an objective, non-arbitrary determination of what constitutes a more perfect or ideal human being, that is, a model of human nature, naturae humanae exemplar, for which all individual human beings strive, at least in principle, if not consciously. It is the human being that is most successful in its striving for perseverance, the human being of maximal conatus, what Spinoza will call the free person, the homo liber. If every individual is essentially and by its nature striving to maintain its being and even increase its power, then this condition of maximal power is the ideal state toward which every individual naturally and necessarily, that is, objectively and by its nature, strives. A tree is striving to be a maximally perfect tree, and a giraffe is striving to be a maximally perfect giraffe. A human being, in turn, is striving to be a maximally powerful human being, and it is precisely such a successfully striving human being that the model of human nature is supposed to capture. And in this way, the model is no mere subjective ideal, but anchored in the metaphysical reality of things. So to conclude, this model of human nature allows us to make sense of yet another initially puzzling distinction that Spinoza makes between the knowledge of good and bad and what he calls the true knowledge of good and bad. If something brings about a small-scale improvement in one's being, an increase in his or her power in this or that respect, then it is a cause of joy and thus good, and one's belief that it is good is not without justification. However, as we have seen, this improvement or joy, this passive affect, may be only partial, temporary, and short-lived. The true knowledge of good and bad, by contrast, refers to informed beliefs about those things that bring about full and lasting improvement in one's condition. That is, the things that truly do move one closer in one's overall being to the model of human nature. There thus seems to be no getting around the fact that, despite occasional language that suggests that good and bad are only in the mind of the beholder, given what Spinoza says about conatus and the ways in which things can help an individual in its striving, it is a matter of fact, causally independent of any antecedent mental attitudes, that something is or is not good. This is a feature of Spinoza's thought that endures from the very first paragraph of his extant writings, where in the treatise of the Emendation of the Intellect he says that the true good is that which would continuously give me the greatest joy, and is the means towards acquiring a human nature much stronger and more enduring than his own, to his mature metaphysics, to his mature masterpiece, the Ethics. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. You did a very good job in
29
keeping.
seconds over, I think.
Ok. Lorenzo, à toi, essaie de rester dans les 10 minutes.
Tu m'arrêtes.
Non, je t'arrête pas. Je ne suis pas un flic.
Surtout pas en ce moment. Bon. Ah oui, pardon.
Oh oui, pardon.
Sorry. Donc évidemment, avant de commencer, je m'associe aux remerciements qui ont été déjà abondants pour l'accueil qui nous a été réservé par l'Université de Saint-Denis et de Paris-Est, pour nous donner l'occasion ainsi de rencontrer, d'écouter, de parler avec nos collègues américains. Je rappelle que cette rencontre fait écho à une autre rencontre qui avait eu lieu il y a quelques années, qui s'appelait le Spinoza transalpin, qui a été publié depuis. Et donc, je suppose qu'il faudra attendre le Spinoza transatlantique pour faire le pendant de ces deux journées. Alors, la communication Spinoza on Good and Bad de Stephen Nadler a le mérite d'affronter l'une des grandes questions du spinozisme, celle de la nature et des usages des notions de bien et de mal, qui en marquent à la fois son début, mais aussi sa fin. C'est en effet par là que Spinoza entre en philosophie, au début du traité de la réforme de l'entendement, et qu'il achève aussi l'éthique, en montrant la voie qui mène à notre souverain bien. Son autre mérite est celui de dépasser le point auquel les interprètes très souvent s'arrêtent, à savoir le premier stade de cette conception, la phase que l'on pourrait appeler critique, ou comme l'appellent certains, relativiste ou subjectiviste, qui assigne aux notions de bien et de mal, comparablement à celle de perfection, une valeur purement relative. Bien et mal ne seraient que des manières de penser. Certes, le mal et le bien n'ont pas de réalité en soi, ils ne disent rien d'autre, rien de la nature intrinsèque des choses. Mais ils ne sont pas rien pour autant. Stephen Nadler ne s'arrête pas à la pars destruens de la critique spinoziste, celle qui repousse toute ontologisation du mal et toute pensée du mal radical. Ce n'est là, pour ainsi dire, qu'une propédeutique, décisive dans la mesure où elle contribue à distinguer la morale de l'éthique et néanmoins insuffisante pour comprendre la position de Spinoza. Bien et mal ne sont pas seulement une affaire d'opinion ou de préjugés, ou une simple expression du désir. En tant que qualité, qualities, ils recouvrent une certaine réalité objective. Pour montrer cela, Stephen élargit le champ de l'analyse en s'appuyant habilement sur une série de textes regroupés en 9 thèses distinctes, autant d'arguments qui éclairent l'étendue de la doctrine selon ces différentes positions. En effet, l'ancrage dans l'affect et dans le désir, notamment avec le célèbre renversement du scoli 9 de la troisième partie, quand nous nous efforçons à une chose, quand nous la voulons, quand nous aspirons à elle ou la désirons, ce n'est jamais parce que nous jugeons qu'elle est bonne, mais au contraire, si nous jugeons qu'une chose est bonne, c'est parce que nous nous y efforçons, nous la voulons, nous y aspirons ou la désirons. Eh bien, ce renversement ouvre en même temps à la possibilité de penser le bien et le mal en un sens relationnel et néanmoins objectif, voire universel, puisqu'il se fonde sur la possibilité d'atteindre une connaissance certaine de ce qui est vraiment utile pour nous. La question du bien et du mal est ainsi non seulement réorientée à partir du désir, dont il est possible de connaître les lois universelles, mais elle est recomprise à partir de, je cite Stephen, la cause qui augmente ou diminue le pouvoir d'agir des individus. Fin de citation. Dès lors, il est possible de lire les nouvelles définitions données par Spinoza au début de la quatrième partie de l'éthique comme ouvrant sur une doctrine positive du bon et du mauvais, objectivement comprise selon les variations de la puissance qu'entraînent les relations du désir à ces objets. Sans référer à une réalité ontologique intrinsèque en soi, le bien et le mal recouvrent alors une réalité relationnelle, mais qui n'en est pas moins réelle et objective, dans la mesure où il garde une certaine indépendance vis-à-vis de l'esprit. Donc, en un sens, on est un peu à l'opposé de la proposition de Michael Nadler. Au sens plein du terme, est donc bon ce qui accroît la puissance d'un individu et lui permet de perfectionner sa nature. Bien, sur les thèses défendues par Stephen Nadler, je n'ai malheureusement pas d'objection à faire, dans la mesure où je les partage en grande partie. Donc je suis bien gêné. Notamment, je partage, c'est peut-être ça que j'aimerais souligner, la perspective relationnelle et à la fois objective qui, à mon sens, d'ailleurs peut être étendue ou tenue vis-à-vis d'autres notions chez Spinoza, qui recouvre également une nature relationnelle et objective. Mais je laisse ça de côté puisque nous nous occupons du bien et du mal. Je vais donc me limiter à quelques observations et remarques.
4 observations.
Non, 2, quelques.
Ah,
3,
pardon, excuse-moi,
2,
je suis...
je peux en enlever. J'ai marqué quelques observations, laissant à d'autres, s'il y a lieu, le soin de faire des objections. Mes remarques formulées sous forme de questions ne remettent donc nullement en cause le bien fondé des thèses de Stephen et ni mon accord substantiel avec elles. Elles sont plutôt une invitation à poursuivre la réflexion sur certains points. Donc là, j'en ai 3 plus 1. Tu me dis si...
Mais non, vas-y, je m'excuse. Mon oreille m'a joué un mauvais tour.
C'est peut-être ma langue qui a fourché. Alors, je commencerai par une remarque générale de méthode, puisque on oppose souvent la méthode anglo-saxonne à la méthode continentale. La méthode argumentative et la lecture interne dont témoigne l'article de Stephen n'est pas étrangère au néo-spinozisme de l'école française, marquée par l'empreinte laissée par Guéroult et Matron. L'identification des 9 thèses dont vous faites état sont très utiles, évidemment, pour mesurer l'étendue des différents aspects de la position de Spinoza, notamment dans l'éthique. Néanmoins, le prologue du traité de la réforme de l'entendement et le parcours même proposé par l'éthique considèrent également le développement de la vie éthique dans sa dimension expérientielle. Comme le montre le début du TRE, mais également l'éthique, par nombre de propositions, le parcours éthique est loin d'être linéaire ou droit. La dimension temporelle, du coup, et historique, qui est peut-être un peu absente de votre propos, reste, pour ainsi dire, en arrière-plan de l'analyse argumentative. Vous préférez l'analyse logique des arguments. Pour autant, pensez-vous qu'il serait possible, ce serait ma première question, d'y intégrer aussi une dimension plus expérientielle ou existentielle qui rende compte du perfectionnement éthique aussi d'un point de vue temporel? Deuxième question. D'un côté, vous montrez bien que le relativisme spinoziste ne s'épuise pas dans un subjectivisme, mais que son relationnisme se fonde sur une forme d'objectivité ouverte, par ailleurs, sur les diversités culturelles. De même, l'objectivité du bien, fondée dans la positivité de la puissance, se distingue de tout universalisme abstrait, sans pour autant renoncer à ce que le TTP appelait une éthique universelle, valable donc pour tous les hommes. Puisqu'après tout, nous sommes un certain nombre parmi les spinozistes à avoir tenté de lire dans le monisme de Spinoza une ontologie des relations, et je me range volontiers parmi ceux-là, je me demande quelle différence il conviendrait de faire entre relativisme et subjectivisme d'une part, et entre objectif et universel d'autre part. Ou si vous préférez, en quoi un relativisme des valeurs participe d'une conception relationnelle et objective du bien. Troisième question, qui est peut-être celle plus, je passe du général au particulier, plus textuelle, si vous voulez. Je m'interroge enfin sur une proposition qui, sauf erreur de ma part, ne semble pas trouver de place dans votre cartographie des arguments spinozistes sur le bien et le mal. Je veux parler en particulier de la proposition 64 de la 4e partie. Cognitio mali, cognitio est inadequata. La connaissance du mal est une connaissance inadéquate. Et également la proposition 68, toujours de la même 4e partie, si omnes nascentur liberi, nullum boni et mali formarem conceptum, quandio, aussi longtemps, liberi essent, avec son scroll. On peut donc raisonnablement penser que l'expérience de la liberté s'accompagne de la libération des concepts de bien et de mal. En tout état de cause, la connaissance vraie du bien et du mal n'est pas ou ne vaut pas la connaissance adéquate du bien et du mal. Surtout si on pense à Éthique 4.14, selon laquelle la vraie connaissance du bien et du mal, en tant que vrai quatenus vera, ne peut réprimer aucun affect. Vera boni et mali cognitio quatenus vera nullum affectum coerce potest. Il pourrait être ici intéressant, c'est ma suggestion, de revenir sur cette différence entre vrai et adéquat, déjà abordée hier, peut-être aussi pour essayer de sortir des apparents dualismes dans lesquels on finit nécessairement par tomber entre passif et actif, entre relativité et objectivité des biens. En d'autres termes, je me demande si, dans la perspective objectiviste, comme la vôtre, il est encore possible de maintenir une parfaite symétrie dans le couple mal-bien. Au-delà des termes en usage, sur le chemin de la progression éthique dont parlait Pascal tout à l'heure, ne convient-il pas, autant que nous le pouvons, de considérer le mal, la tristesse, la diminution de puissance, malgré tout, comme des manières positives, des certains degrés de puissance, c'est-à-dire comme autant d'opportunités d'exercice, de compréhension et d'augmentation de la puissance d'agir. Dans ce sens objectif, il n'y aurait au fond, je pousse un peu, que du bien. Seriez-vous d'accord pour aller dans ce sens?
In coda venenum, ou en tout cas objection. Stephen, you may reply. We have to be a little strict with time.
I'll take 1 minute.
No, take your time. But other people certainly want to ask questions as well.
So I'll just quickly talk about the whether we can have an adequate idea of bad. It's true that Proposition 64, Part 4 says the cognitio mali est inadequata. But if you distinguish between the knowledge of bad and the true knowledge of bad, so in Proposition 8 of Part 4, he says that the knowledge of bad is an affect of pleasure or pain of which we are conscious, so that would be an inadequate idea. But in the Scholium to Proposition 17, he does say that the true knowledge of good and evil is a function of true reason, vera ratio, which suggests that an adequate idea of bad is possible for the person who is not just suffering the passive affect, but has come to transform that inadequate idea into an adequate one. And that's why I think that a mind that has only adequate ideas would form no notion of evil, and therefore you conclude there could be no adequate idea of evil. But still, one can, if you never had any inadequate ideas, it's true. But a person who has inadequate ideas would have the capacity to develop an adequate idea of evil on the basis of the inadequate ideas. So I do think that an adequate idea of evil or bad is possible.
Idea. Ok. Je pense qu'il faut ouvrir la salle. Bien, merci, c'est très intéressant. Alors, je voudrais essayer de regagner un tout petit peu parce qu'on a commencé légèrement en retard. Donc, j'ai Chantal Jaquet, j'ai quelqu'un ici, autre deuxième rang, je ne sais pas le nom, et là-bas, au fond. On prend les 3 questions à la suite, peut-être, et Stephen répond ensuite. Qu'est-ce que vous préférez? What do you prefer?
Quand vous voulez, si vous posez la question en français,
allons-y, ne perdons pas de
parler
temps.
lentement.
Chantal Jaquet.
Alors, merci Steven pour cette communication avec laquelle je suis en grande partie d'accord, surtout parce que fait la distinction entre relativisme et subjectivisme. Et quand justement nous avons commencé le séminaire Spinoza à la Sorbonne il y a 15 ans avec Pascal et Ariel, c'était sur la partie 4 de l'éthique et sur ces questions consacrées précisément à la conservation des notions de bien et de mal après leur critique. Et tu embrasses les deux à la fois, c'est-à-dire à la fois la critique et puis la justification. Alors nous avons eu des grands débats sur la question du modèle de la nature humaine. Alors je voudrais un peu te demander comment tu conçois ce modèle, puisque la justification de la conservation des notions de bien et de mal passe par le fait que nous désirons former un modèle, une idée de la nature humaine qui soit comme un modèle. Alors, d'abord, qui vise ce nous? Parce qu'à la différence du traité de l'indépendance, Spinoza ne dit pas « je décidais de voir s'il y avait un bien communicable », mais nous désirons former, qui est ce nous? Et d'autre part, est-ce que ce désir de former une idée, ça renvoie à une imagination, ou est-ce que c'est une conception rationnelle, ou bien les deux? Alors, je vais arrêter là parce que...
So I'll take the second question first, and I know that some people in the audience here believe that the model of human nature is a function of the imagination. I don't think it is. I think the desire to form the idea of the model of human nature is perhaps essential to us as a function of our striving, that we cannot help but have a conception of ourselves as a more perfect or a model before our minds of the perfection of our nature. I think it's metaphysically necessary because that's what the striving is. Now, the difficulty for me is how to say that without attributing too much teleology to our striving, but I'm not sure I need to avoid all teleology. So the answer to your question is I think that the desire directed at the model of human nature is a natural and metaphysically necessary one of what we are, and therefore not just a function of the imagination.
Bien. Monsieur, je ne sais pas votre nom, excusez-moi.
Michael Denaro.
Ah.
Thank you, Stephen, for a very characteristically clear paper and very helpful. And Lorenzo, I found your questions very useful too. I just had a question, a very simple question, Steve, about the objectivity of goodness and bad. And I'm very sympathetic to the overall view, but you do allow that good and bad are relative properties. I wonder if the relationality there is going to be an occasion for the re-entrance of some kind of subjectivity. Because depending on one's views, on Spinoza's views, on what relations are, whether relations are mind-dependent, which is actually a very common view in the period, then that would be a way for subjectivity or relation to a mind to creep back in because of the relationality which you rightly insist on.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, at one point, Spinoza calls these beings of reason. In the longer version of this, I actually address that, and I do think that the temptation there is to think of beings of reason as either functions of the imagination or subjective ideals. Maybe for now I should just direct you to my longer discussion of that, but I don't think that despite the apparent danger, I think it can be saved. My reading can be saved from that.
Nous avons une question au fond. Quelqu'un là-bas? C'est vous, monsieur? Isaac Melamed, oui.
I like very much the paper. It's rich, although there are some more extreme pronouncements of Spinoza, including claiming that there is a sum bonum, which is the knowledge of God, which might be even more objective. But that's not the issue. What bothers me more is the claims that you make towards the end of the paper that the human being strives to be a maximally powerful human being, and a giraffe strives to be a maximally powerful giraffe. Now, that's, to my ear, sounds pretty much theological. But more than that, think about the poor giraffe with 3 legs. The poor giraffe with 3 legs, it does not strive to be a maximally powerful giraffe, because most giraffes are much more powerful. And it would be futile for the poor giraffe to strive to be a maximally powerful giraffe, because it will never get there. So I don't think that the issue of kind can play any role here.
No, I think you're right.
The kind should be just completely erased from the story.
Good question.
I think the giraffe, the 3-legged giraffe, should be striving to be the maximally powerful individual that it is. I think you're absolutely right about that. Except, just for the sake of argument, except that we also strive to make others as similar to ourselves in nature. And so there is a kind of kind that enters into this, that we are striving to become, to socially or in general, to become individuals more like each other in kind, more perfect.
Right, the similarity in kind decrease. So,
yeah, no, your point's well taken, especially about the giraffe.
okay.
That's a good question. It could be expanded in other directions, woman and man, child and adult,
Yeah.
and so on. On a le temps pour une autre question.
Oui. Je voudrais poser une question qui va peut-être dans un sens plus objectiviste encore que vous avez. Si on prend les lettres à Greenberg, quand Greenberg pose la question, quelqu'un qui aurait de la joie à tuer, par exemple, pas seulement de titulation, mais une vraie hilaritas, peut-être plus, pourquoi pas, ça, il arriverait à la béatitude en plein de gens. Est-ce que cette fiction vous semble-t-elle plausible, c'est-à-dire elle est cohérente avec les systèmes de Spinoza? Parce que peut-être est-ce qu'on ne pourrait pas dire que c'est tout simplement une hypothèse impossible et contradictoire avec la pensée de Spinoza, étant donné que ce sont les êtres qui nous ressemblent, qui se composent plus avec nous, qui peuvent nous apporter donc plus de joie, 3 sens de joie sont un peu plus de joie, c'est-à-dire, et là on est vraiment dans une philosophie beaucoup plus normative que Deleuze a voulu en faire, me semble-t-il.
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult question to answer.
It is indeed.
I have to confess to you, I'm not quite sure I got the entire question, but you're pushing the point about whether, given Spinoza's views on possibility, we were asking whether Spinoza's views on possibility and the reading whereby there is no really such thing as the merely possible is consistent with this notion of desire and the striving for greater perfection and the joy that moves us. Is that correct?
Oui, mais dans ce sens-là, on aurait tout de même une position beaucoup moins relativiste. C'est-à-dire, tuer, faire des choses semblables, serait nécessairement quelque chose de mauvais. Je ne veux pas dire du mal, parce que certes, il ne faut pas ontologiser les mal et les biens, on n'est pas dans une pensée manichéiste, bien sûr, mais il y a tout de même, étant donné la nature humaine et telle que Spinoza l'a décrit, une certaine objectivité du bon et du mauvais, ou du bien et du mal.
So in a way, I think my answer to that would be similar, my tentative answer to that would be similar to my answer to Chantal's question, that it's not as if we have a concept, it's not as if the conception of the model of human nature is the notion of an ideal possibility, but it's not just that, but it's grounded in what we are. We cannot help but. So there's a kind of necessity, not merely a possibility in our conception of this model, but a necessity in it. Does that help answer?
Yeah.
Quand l'instinct de mort pointe son nez, les choses se gâtent. Bien. Merci. Thank you so much, Stephen. Wonderful presentation.